This is a love letter to the late 90s and early 2000s 3D platformers. Spyro, Mario, Banjo, Sonic, and even Zelda. There was a period of time at the end of the millennium when if you thought of the quintessential video game, these were what came to mind. Rather than sandbox games or shooters, polygonal characters in a bright, colorful world filled with cutesy threats and collectibles, and yet somehow still exuding a little attitude. The thrill of moving a little guy around a 3D space, whether he was fast or slow, whether he was stuck on the ground or could soar through the air, whether he was human or beast, just being able to move a stick and see them come to life was enough to get excited about. These were simple times. But you'd be surprised what a tall order it was to even design a 3D game that was fun and playable, instead of clunky and frustrating. There wasn't a rulebook for how to make 3D platformers work. There wasn't a history of games proving the success of the concept to reference when the technology was so brand new. So a lot of games tried a lot of different things. Some worked, and some didn't. And some of it just comes down to preference. It was a very experimental time. Although many of the games seemed similar in concept, there were a lot of creative differences between their designs and how they took advantage of and tried to utilize the new third dimension. A lot of game series felt pushed into 3D kicking and screaming, but some really thrived with the new possibilities brought with it. One of the new challenges of this era was how to handle camera movement and control. Many games tried to ease players in who also wouldn't have had a lot of experience with this genre, and give them a lot of control over the camera and help them get comfortable navigating these spaces. And in a game like Mario 64, you really feel like you need it, because half of the challenge is trying to figure out what's around you, what enemies are there that you can't see, and figuring out how close to edges you are when depth is so tricky to get a feel for on a flat TV screen. Mario, which in 2D was all about speed and getting through a level while managing the plumber's momentum as the clock ticks down, becomes a much slower experience here. The timer is gone altogether, and now Mario is faced with small but open-feeling levels, packed to the brim with ways to die. Mario can still physically build up speed, of course, by running and jumping, but the actual pace of gameplay is slower. Falling by dying, making the wrong jump, or running out of health boots you back out to the hub world, where you have to start the level over from the beginning. Accomplishing anything difficult requires a lot of very tedious and methodical repetition of the same stretches of level with minor adjustments here and there, and a lot of patience. So standing completely still and rotating the camera manually, or stopping to look around is not going to mess up any of your attempts or give you a time penalty. You can slow down and really think about what you're doing most of the time if you need to, unless you're on the Rainbow Cruise. The levels aren't as big and sprawling as some 3D games, but instead smaller and more intimate, focusing on lethal threats, tricky jumps, and a variety of objectives that make use of the same space and hazards in different ways. Some games take the control out of your hands entirely, like Sonic, where they expect you to just keep holding the correct direction to make it through shuttle loops while the camera changes angles for you to get the most cinematic view. Your job is solely to interpret the road ahead of you and react accordingly without missing a beat. Unlike Mario, Sonic maintains his 2D speed. Normally in 2D, his levels are about moving through the space with a variety of hazards and trying to do it as quickly as you can as the timer ticks up. The real goal of the game is not only to beat the level, but to beat your own best time and score as you replay entire levels and memorize the hazards and the quickest way to overcome them. It's basically speedrunning the game. In Mario, you gotta replay levels to make up for failures, but here you replay levels to get a better score than the last time you went through. The trick to doing well is to become intimately acquainted with the game and memorize a fastest route, all while building the skill to pull it off flawlessly. 3D Sonic takes these design elements and more or less perfectly maintains them, only adding in places where you have to remember what the camera is going to do as well. And with an emphasis on physical speed, sometimes you just have to adapt to momentum carrying you through shuttle loops without your input. You do have very little control over the camera, but that's because stopping to look around manually and see everything around you isn't the goal here. Stopping at all is costing you points in the form of a time bonus you're wasting. I think whether you prefer the Mario or Sonic style of camera control really comes down to what pace you prefer to play at. For me, playing a good fast 3D Sonic game and managing to hit all the jumps and getting your route for the high score just right is like practicing a song on the guitar and finally managing to make sweet music. It just feels so good to write out that melody without making a mistake or missing a note. Mario is more zen. Sometimes I don't even realize how many times I've retried the same challenges again and again, despite how repetitive it can be. There's a satisfaction in persisting until you get each star, maybe more like a steady drumbeat. While we're on the subject of games that tried to directly translate an earlier 2D counterpart into 3D, take Ocarina of Time for example. And before you try to tell me that this is not a 3D platformer, okay, you've got a point. But it uses the same engine as Super Mario 64, and many of the dungeons involve platforming, so I say it at least sort of counts. In the overhead Zeldas, to make Link jump over a ledge, you just moved him forward towards one and he did it automatically. Link can't jump over gaps at all, with the exception of the handheld games, where jumping is accomplished with an item. Sword combat was based on timing around enemies' unique attacks and animations, since swinging and aiming the sword itself was not about using dexterity, but accomplished with a single button press. Timing and puzzling were the main focuses of gameplay over agility. When translated to a 3D game, they could have just used a face button for jumping like many other similar games. But instead, like traditional Zelda, the face buttons are a resource to be managed by the player to equip and unequip items to. To jump, Link now hops automatically over ledges and gaps by moving forward towards them, and the Z targeting system takes aiming Link's sword and weapons out of the equation and focuses more on the timing of attacks, just like before. Sort of. Of course, it's still more in-depth, with more dimensions than the flat games, but they more or less adapted what was already there in the series to move ahead into the uncharted frontier of the 5th generation. Now, rather than can you kill an enemy being a simple binary yes or no question, it's much more like a flowchart. Whether or not it always works perfectly is another story, but I feel like this was a surprising success considering how much other games had to change their formulas to survive with the jump to 3D controls and cameras. Of course, there were newcomers in this era too that weren't adapting previously established gameplay, and rather were building something brand new from the ground up to suit the new 3D landscape. The two examples that come to mind, Banjo and Spyro, are really two different flavors of the same style of game. The fun of adding a dimension is really having the freedom to explore a fantasy world as if you were really there, and figuring out how to get to something cool you see in the distance. They nailed down what the benefit was in moving to 3D and game design in the first place, and focused on exploration as the main gameplay loop. Banjo Kazooie is a series that began in the 3D era, but it was designed by the seasoned platforming veterans at Rare. They had already built a series of fun side-scrollers, the Donkey Kong Country games, and you can see some of the same design choices translated in Banjo to a 3D environment. Except rather than having to adapt and tailor these elements to work in 3D, the additional dimension only seemed to unlock whatever restraints were keeping Rare's power levels in check, and they went absolutely feral with creativity. The crates you could open to free Donkey Kong's animal friends and unlock their unique moves got a spiritual successor in Mumbo's transformations. The major difference being that while all these essentially have the same moveset and aren't unique in their abilities, the way they're utilized in each level changes up the gameplay pretty significantly. Actually, the level designs themselves vary so much that nearly every level felt like a completely different game. Wouldn't it be cool if we had you do a race in this level as a walrus? How about a boss fight out of the blue when most levels don't have them? What if you could break the windows and go inside the cabins of this big ship? What if Banjo could just turn into a bee and fly around? Ooh, what if you could stay a bee and do stuff in the hub world as a bee? It feels like they had a childlike sense of wonder in their approach to 3D gaming and really took advantage of the new dimension in as many ways as they could. The design is wildly unrestrained, fun, and creative, and that kind of ambition itself feels like a relic of the time period. 3D game design was an unprecedented challenge, yes, but it was also an opportunity to achieve what never could have been possible before. Of course, I call this Rare being unrestrained, but we know in hindsight that this was still actually them toning it down when you compare Banjo Kazooie to Banjo Tooie and Donkey Kong 64. In Kazooie, the levels are just the right size with just the right number of collectibles to keep the stakes high enough that you want to avoid dying and having to start over collecting music notes, but not so big that it gets overwhelming. The same can't necessarily be said for some of Rare's other platformers on the N64. One of the things you start to notice in the newer series that are built for 3D from the ground up is that they all have a greater degree of accessibility to newer players who don't have a lot of experience with either video games in general or in particular 3D platformers. Banjo and Kazooie have several of the same moves as Mario. Supposedly they were inspired directly by Super Mario 64, but having the two characters gives you a lot more control over execution of movement. Banjo moves slowly and deliberately, and Kazooie adds speed, height, and other complicated dynamics that you unlock as you explore each area. But since using Kazooie requires an intentional button combo, you can be really precise in how fast you want to go through each section. You don't build up momentum like Mario, so you can really stop on a dime and turn around and plan your jumps without any consequences. And you can always take things slower when you need to. Banjo also had more of a focus on exploration of each level. In Mario, you're told before you begin the level what the name of the star you're trying to collect is, which gives you a goal each time you enter, and you automatically exit the level after completion of that goal. But Banjo levels don't give you that information up front, and you have to search the massive levels for each Jiggy and figure out what you need to do as you make your way through them. The level doesn't end until you choose to leave the way you came in. Additionally, there are lots of areas or challenges that you can't take on until you find bottles to teach Kazooie more moves, so there's a sense of growth and progress tied to reaching new areas that you haven't been to before. The progression of the game itself is tied to finding enough notes and Jiggies to open the barriers in the massive hub world, and each new area found and explored rewards the player with new collectibles. It's hard to describe what in particular Spyro the Dragon does other platformers of the time don't, but if I had to boil it down, it's a combination of polish and simplicity. Insomniac had no prior similar titles under their belt, so they built Spyro totally differently than its contemporaries. There's a lot of simple elements that when put together just work really well. It's not a complicated game, but it is tightly designed and relies on players building up skill at the game as they go to conquer harder and harder challenges. First, Spyro's movement is pretty simple to understand and master. All of the games mentioned so far have had fairly complex controls. Controllers weren't really standardized for what style would work with a 3D game. The N64 controller had 3 handles and a plethora of face buttons clustered around a central stick, so you had to hold the controller in different ways to play different games. Saturn came out with a separate controller just for 3D games that's shaped like a disc and feels terrible to hold. Early PlayStation controllers didn't have sticks at all and relied on a D-pad for 3D movement. But in spite of all this, Insomniac really mastered giving the player a lot of options on how to traverse a large, multi-dimensional level while keeping the controls simple. In Spyro, X jumps, square charges, circle breathes fire, and triangle lets you look around. They're context sensitive too. Pressing X again at the top of a jump turns the jump into a longer glide, but in a way that gives the player a lot of ability to stay precise with planning jumps, and that doesn't feel as spontaneous as Mario 64 did. In Mario, the movement controls are relatively simple in that they only utilize 3 buttons, but Mario will sometimes unexpectedly do different things depending on how you fling him at something, or which combination of buttons you press to perform the action, or how much momentum Mario had at the time. In Spyro, you know that X during a jump will only ever be a glide, and that predictably, if you charge while gliding, Spyro will plummet, or if you hop while charging, Spyro will do a small hop but stay low to the ground. There are no wall jumps or extra long jumps or momentum-based things that you have to look out for. Mastery of Spyro simply boils down to knowing at what point in your jump you want to glide to get the optimum distance, and combining the handful of tools that you have to solve the various problems that you'll come up against. And much like Banjo, Spyro has different speeds that you can utilize for different situations. You can charge through big open expanses, or slow it down to a walk to carefully get right up next to a ledge. Second, Spyro's lives/hit points/checkpoint system is much more forgiving than its counterpart. Compared to the arcade-style live systems where you had to restart from scratch quite frequently, that was still common in other games, Spyro gives you a lot of opportunities to regain health, lots of mid-level checkpoints, and collectibles aren't lost when you miss a jump and die. Sparks the Dragonfly even makes collecting gems easier, as he'll fly over and grab them for you if you get close enough to one. This keeps the pace of the game nice and fast, since you don't have to stop moving to collect things, and keeps you from needing to slow down and tediously repeat sections of levels beyond 1 or 2 tricky jumps. And Spyro's speedy charge makes getting back up to those high points to glide down to new areas take less time, so your attempts can be closer together. Spyro was also where aesthetically 3D games reached a new height. It was one of the first games to utilize level of detail loading, where faraway objects would be loaded in less detail to allow things to load in further in the distance without drawing as many resources or needing to hide behind fog. This made Spyro's already massive and sprawling levels really feel as big as they were. Not to mention, there were 35 of these huge levels total, which was way more than Super Mario 64's 15 or Banjo Kazooie's 9. And all of these levels have a very cohesive and distinctive art style, full of pastels and bright saturated color schemes. Many of Spyro's levels make use of the expanded load distance by putting platforms full of treasure in view that you need to make blind jumps around corners to reach, or that can only be reached by gliding from the very top of a level. So it's this combination of simple movement, difficulty that's forgiving of mistakes, and these huge levels designed with tons of secrets that make Spyro unique and extremely fun to play. Levels could be explored without fear of running into a challenge that you can't overcome, and you could experiment freely to try to figure out how to reach everything that's in front of you. If you think Spyro can get somewhere that seems just barely possible to reach, odds are that there's some treasure hiding there waiting for you. Really, no space in a level is wasted. One of the main goals of Spyro is to rescue dragons that you find around levels, and these don't unlock moves the way the bottles in Banjo Kazooie does, but rather they give you hints that go a long way towards figuring out a level's secrets without necessarily spelling it all out for you. When I figured out that you could glide all the way across the river in Clifftown, it blew my mind as a kid. Or even figuring out that you could get to the hills surrounding the main level in Stone Hill. There's a beauty in the wild experimentation of this genre, and in the years since, as the failed attempts to pull off the open world 3D platformer have faded away into obscurity, it's easy to forget just what a challenge it was to overnight translate an entire industry from 2D to 3D. We tend to only remember the good examples like these and take for granted how well they were designed, without the context of the challenges that they had to overcome. So let's take a moment to appreciate how these games still managed to get it just so right. Even if not every 3D game from this time period is everyone's cup of tea, there's little in gaming history that can compare to the late 90s in terms of how fast the technology evolved and how many franchises were left in the dust. There's a wasteland of 3D games from this time period that delivered the uninspired to the unplayable. A lot of games ended up cancelled or in development hell for years, buckling under the pressure to keep up with a rapidly evolving industry. So many developers didn't have the resources, know-how, or ingenuity to make the transition, when games suddenly required an entirely new skill set and a much larger budget. The challenging circumstances of this time period makes it all the more amazing that we witnessed the birth of this genre, and that a few games shine like a star in spite of it all. I didn't have time to cover every great 3D platformer in this video, so please let me know in the comments if there's any I didn't talk about that you love. Today's show and tell item from my collection, while I ask you all to subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notifications, is my Japanese Furby. I got this a little while ago thinking it might speak Japanese, but Furbies apparently didn't speak Japanese in Japan until 2013. So this one only speaks English and Furbish. Here's its cool box though. Wow, very cool. And here's the manual and its certified pedigree. I have more videos in the works, so stay tuned.